Good morning. I'm Becky Sepperly, and I'm with the Greater Kanawha Valley Foundation, and welcome. We're delighted to see so many of you here today. It's a pleasure. You're going to enjoy. I spent the day yesterday with our speaker, and you're going to really enjoy listening to him, and he'll, I know, want to listen to you as well. So, excuse me. The order of the day, we'll have breakfast, spend about 15 minutes then eating breakfast, and then we'll have the program will begin. But before we begin, I thought it might be appropriate, not inappropriate, but appropriate, to have a moment of silence for those here in the United States, in Baltimore in particular, and those around the world in Nepal who are struggling and not as fortunate as we are today to be able to sit down to a beautiful place and have a nice lunch or a nice breakfast and begin to talk about how we can recreate our city. So if you would, let's just take a moment of silence. Thank you. And now we'll begin with breakfast and give you about 15 minutes to eat a little bit and begin the program.
It is ever so critical for our communities to make them better, to become stronger, to become the West Virginia that we want to be on the local, regional, and state level. While we experience many challenges in West Virginia, we also seem to have, and we should accept, great honor of amazing accomplishments. Many of you in this room are doing great work, and we're so thrilled to have individuals not here just from Charleston, but from the northern panhandle to the southern coalfields, from the Potomac River to the Middle Ohio Valley. We thought when we hosted Rip here from Kresge, we might have a small group of maybe 30 or 50. We're so pleased to have nearly 90 here. But also, we're going from West Virginia to the world today, thanks to our friends at West Virginia Public Broadcasting. We're broadcasting live stream, and our thanks to Scott Finn and Chuck Roberts and their team to be able to share this with our friends across the regional association communities, across all 50 states, our friends at the Kresge Foundation, as well as the Greater Kanawha Valley Foundation. When you think about philanthropy, we talk about convening sectors, partnering, taking risks, innovating, being the sector that is allowed to really create solutions, to provide leadership, and looking at the philanthropy's role in ethical leadership. And what we are also smart to know is philanthropy. We're not the only one in the game. Our success has resulted in working with the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. But we also must realize that we work across political ideologies, we work across communities. And Charleston's success is Wheeling's success, just as it is Tomahawk's success in Barbersville. And when we work across all those sectors, as ethical leaders across all the areas, we see amazing results. Now you might laugh, when I've talked about philanthropy, I didn't mention the money. But no, I didn't. Because the money isn't always the thing with philanthropy. It's that convening power, that potential in building collaborations. And so in the honor of our good friend and guest here today, Rip Rapson from Michigan, I use the words of Henry Ford. Coming together is a beginning. Keeping together is progress. Working together is success. Let me say that again. Coming together is a beginning. Keeping together is progress. Working together is success. Henry Ford was thinking of many things as a business leader, as a philanthropist. Again, reassuring the importance of the long game as philanthropy. We focus not just on a term of election of 2 or 4 or 6 years. Our dedication is the next 25, 50, and 100 years. And so we're so pleased to have you here to hear from Rip. My name is Paul Daugherty, and I serve as CEO of Philanthropy West Virginia, the state leadership association for private, family, corporate, and community grant-making foundations. Our mission is strengthening philanthropy in the Mountain State. And we know that to make that possible here in West Virginia and across Central Appalachia, we must work together. We would not be here today without our good friends in partnering with the Greater Kanawha Valley Foundation, but also the Mayor Foundation. I know Holmes Morrison is here, and let's give a round of applause for the Mayor Foundation to host this program. And for those that are of the social media genre, for those via live broadcast, you can follow us at @PhilanthropyWV and @TGKVF1. Our hashtags are We Are the Answer. Hashtag also is put West Virginia or WV first. As one wise soul recently said in a public policy committee meeting, we sometimes sit around waiting for somebody to come and bring the solutions to our communities and to our causes. We are who we are waiting for. We are the answer. And Detroit and Michigan is a great example of that and the efforts that have taken place. And so Rip, bringing his great skill and expertise since taking over the leadership of the Kresge Foundation in 2006, will share those efforts and those great works. A little bit about Rip, and I have to say, I have had the opportunity to spend the past 24 hours with him, probably more time than he wants to spend with Paul Daugherty than most people would. Thoughtful, hardworking, creative, out of the box, but product-oriented, results-oriented, opportunity. When we sat down yesterday with West Virginia Metro News, they asked, so what can West Virginia learn from Michigan? And the first thing he said is, I don't pretend to know the issues of West Virginia, nor tell West Virginia what to do. And that's a great thing to hear from somebody on the national level, to say, I want to hear from what West Virginia has going on. But he thoughtfully and respectfully shared to us and said, during the best times and the hardest times, we come together as community. It's in our DNA to make things possible. And also he references that when he looks at the resilience of West Virginia, it is just stunning. And also he's impressed as what we're doing. And I guarantee he'll impress all of us with his presentation. With no further ado, Rip Rapson.
Good morning, everybody. Oh my, with that kind of introduction, I have nowhere to go. I have been really struck in the very short time I've been in West Virginia by exactly what Paul described, which is the strength of a community that has this sort of glorious tradition of building things in so many different ways, building community, building economies, building sort of long-term legacy work that from generation to generation has distinguished West Virginia in the most remarkable ways. But, you know, in many ways, it is really tempting to come from a place like Michigan, which has gone through so much turmoil and so much dislocation over the last 30 or 40 years, and say, here are 4 or 5 things that I think that we've learned from Michigan that you absolutely have to do. And the more I heard from folks at lunch yesterday and at dinner last night, the more I was convinced that that's absolutely the wrong approach. That the kinds of ground wire that you have into your community, into your traditions, into your culture, into your leadership models, is unique. And there is a sort of a toughness and a resilience about West Virginians that is really quite remarkable. And so what I'd like to try to do this morning is, again, less sort of suggest clear-cut ways of coming at economic development that will guide you into a new and different future. I just think that only you and the communities you serve can ultimately figure out that path. But what I would like to do, because I come out of philanthropy and because I come out of this very interesting place called Detroit, is talk a little bit about what happens when those two worlds come together, and how has philanthropy thought about taking a place like Detroit, which in many ways, for many people, was on its back and a complete basket case 10 years ago and just ready to be sort of shut down. Are there some lessons that we have drawn within our own community that may or may not resonate with all of you? I've joked with a couple of you at tables that folks around the room attended dinner last night. How many people were at dinner last night? Oh, well, so much for those stories. Okay. I think as a result, I'm going to take a slightly different tack from what I did last night. Last night, I talked about 4 or 5 different ways that philanthropy has sort of worked in Detroit to sort of advance a civic agenda. And I'm going to do a little bit of that, but I'm going to twist it slightly and try to figure out whether there are 4 or 5 ways in which philanthropy can actually have some kind of material impact on the trajectory of an economy, particularly of an economy that's going through rapid change and is having to recalibrate, in some cases, some of its most fundamental principles. So let me, I don't think I have to set the table too extensively for you for Detroit, other than to say, and forgive me, folks from last night, that in 2009, the sort of the slow and difficult decline that Detroit had experienced ever since the civil disturbances, the riots of the 60s, really came to a head. And it came to a head for 3 or 4 reasons. One was the Great Recession that we all suffered through and just threw us all into a different way of thinking about the future economy. Second was the foreclosure crisis. Detroit was particularly vulnerable to the kinds of predatory lending that just became the sort of the bane of that crisis, and we saw thousands upon thousands of homes foreclosed upon, which just exacerbated a general decline in our housing stock. Third, I hope, unlike West Virginia, we had a complete political meltdown in Detroit. We had someone who was called the hip-hop mayor, elected at age 31, Kwame Kilpatrick. I had the great pleasure of spending many, 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 many hours with Kwame Kilpatrick before we realized he was a criminal. And it was a surreal experience to come to Detroit and be part of an administration that was young and hip and energetic and policy-oriented, only to find that underneath all of that was this corrosive set of practices that ultimately led him to be indicted and put in jail. So we had not only a recession, not only the foreclosure crisis, and we had a complete political collapse. And then, by the way, the auto industry was on its back. I think we tend to forget in Detroit that in 2008, 2009, it was, I think, most people's best bet that Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors would all be out of business within a matter of years. And we can, and I'm happy to, talk a little bit about whether the auto bailout made sense. But the point was that it caused Detroit to fundamentally reassess its place in the world, because when you have the kind of powerhouse industry that the automobile industry is in Detroit, and I suspect you can imagine, given sort of the dominance of a number of industries in West Virginia, when that economy just falls out, it's very hard to sort of see around the corner and imagine a future. So I say all of that because what I talked about last night was the methodical attempts that philanthropy made to try to get together as a community, read off the same page, and sort of hold the line until we could get our bearings back again. I think everybody understood that the public sector couldn't walk off the stage forever. We have to have a responsible, competent public sector in order to do our work, not just in Detroit, but anywhere. And it was certainly our expectation that one way or another we would see the revival of the economic base that was represented by the autos. But we didn't know when. We didn't know if it was going to be a year. We didn't know it was going to be 5 years. We didn't know it was going to be 20 years. And so philanthropy went about the business of trying to stitch together a set of gestures that would create scaffolding for the community, whether it was in transit or in land use reform or in housing policy or in arts and culture policy, things that would sort of give us a sense that we had stabilized enough so that we could keep people invested in the future of their town. So one of the consequences of that was a coalescing of the foundation community in a way that Detroit had never seen. I think when I arrived in Detroit in 2006, the foundation community didn't talk to one another. We all occupied the same space, but someone did human services, someone did Main Street program, someone did something else. We didn't meet, we didn't talk, we didn't confer, and I think it's safe to say that 6 or 7 or 8 years later, there is a tightness of that community that actually reminds me a great deal of this community. And I think in many ways you are far ahead, certainly are far ahead of where we were 5 or 6 years ago, and are probably every bit as far along as the community in Detroit is now. So a long, long prelude for my wanting to suggest to you 5 or 6 ways that I think philanthropy, as it comes together, can have impact on the economic trajectory of a place. And I'll be interested to see whether you feel any of this resonates at all to Charleston and to West Virginia generally. So having said all that, let me start with where I began last night, which is the role of philanthropy in sort of being a table center. Last night I gave you one example. It was very long. Most of you, I think, glazed over as I talked about it. So I'm going to try something a little bit different and talk about something that actually happened in Minneapolis when I was there a decade ago. About a decade ago, the president of the University of Minnesota, a guy named Mark Yudof, gave a speech to the collected officials of the state of Minnesota that sort of knocked their feet out from under them. He basically spoke for an hour at this huge statewide convening about how the Minneapolis-St. Paul community was absolutely losing its edge. That this community that had produced General Mills and Medtronic and Best Buy and the Pillsbury Company and all of these extraordinary institutions had just lost its competitive zeal. And I was in the audience, and it was really remarkable. I mean, people were hissing and booing. This is the president of the University of Minnesota, our largest, Minnesota's largest educational institution. And Yudof began sort of walking through the ways in which the impulses of collaboration, of the private sector, working with the university sector, working with the public sector, had just sort of disappeared. And everyone was sort of going into their own corners, doing their own thing. And although that might be good for Pillsbury or it might be good for Medtronic, it wasn't good for the community. And it just started a firestorm. Rarely has sort of one speech generated that kind of activity. And so Yudof called me and said, yikes, what am I doing? He's from Texas. He had no clue about what he had just begun. And I said, Mark, you've got to finish what you began. You've really got to figure out some way to capture this energy. And I said, I would suggest that you appoint 19 of the smartest people from different sectors of your community, pull together a commission and figure out what are the 10 or 11 things. And they have to be very practical. They can't be abstract. They can't be what the Chamber of Commerce would do or what the business partnership would do. They have to be very particular to the different sectors. So Yudof did it. They spent about 6 months, and they came up with mush. It was just mush. And so it started all over again. People said, well, you can't even deliver on your promise. So at that point, does anyone remember Control Data Corporation? Control Data Corporation was the first supercomputer firm to create sort of a worldwide presence in the supercomputer business. And the head of Control Data was a guy named Larry Perlman. And Larry had been the chair of this commission that Yudof had set up. And he came into my office and he said, Rep, this just can't do. I mean, we've had this speech that got everybody all worked up. We had this commission that produced nothing, and people are even angrier than they were before. What are we going to do? And I said, and why are you talking to me? At that point, I was running the McKnight Foundation, which is sort of the Kresge of Minneapolis. And he said, what you can do is be the neutral convener of a conversation that is well-informed, that doesn't have a dog in the hunt. Part of the problem with Yudof's commission is it ended up tilting really strongly to the university, and so many of its recommendations were all about what the university could do, the resources the university needed, and it was just marginalized by the business community that just said, really, what? That's not the issue. And he said, and so would you be willing to lead a process that really tried to get at these issues? I didn't even begin to know how to do that. So the best I could do was to call 7 or 8 friends from the business community, leaders from the business community, and said, would you sit with me over a breakfast or two, and we'll try to scope out what a process like this would look like. To make a very long story short, what we ended up doing was creating something called the Itasca Project. Itasca is a little park in northern Minnesota where the headwaters of the Mississippi lie. And for years and years in the 1960s, the corporate community in Minneapolis and St. Paul would take a week, go up to Itasca, and sort of plot out the future of their community. So in the 1960s, this led to the creation of the Guthrie Theater, the attraction of the Washington Senators to Minnesota to become the Minnesota Twins. All of these extraordinary things by, 18 white men sort of sitting in a little retreat center in northern Minnesota figuring out the world. And so I thought, well, it'd be sort of a nice irony to call this the Itasca Project, but to blow it out in a much more expansive way. And what we ended up doing was asking McKinsey and Company to survey all 100 of the largest businesses in the Twin Cities region and just ask very simple questions. What are the issues? What are the resources we have to combat those issues? What are the 3 or 4 priority things that we need to do in order to make forward progress? Very simple. But the nice thing about McKinsey is they had access directly to the CEOs, didn't have to work through, with all due respect, development officers and other folks, but went right to the top. And at the end of about 6 months, they produced a report. And so I and Larry Perlman, the guy from CD, Control Data, and I issued an invitation to the governor, the mayors of Minneapolis and St. Paul, and the CEOs only, not their vice presidents, not their directors of corporate affairs, to come to a meeting of the Itasca Project where we would review the findings of McKinsey and figure out what to do. And we have Minnesota has 2 very strong business organizations. One is the statewide chamber, and one is something called the Minnesota Business Partnership, which is also a coalition of the 100 largest businesses in the state of Minnesota, and they were invited as well. And when they came and McKinsey sort of laid out the agenda, you could actually hear a sort of a gasp in the room, because what McKinsey had found from these interviews with CEOs was not the business partnerships agenda, which had largely been to lower taxation rates and to ease regulatory burdens. And it wasn't the chamber's agenda, which was largely to sort of build the small business space. It was to reform transportation in the region. It was to promote early childhood development in the region. It was to reduce health disparities, and then there were a couple of other things. And I'll never forget, Governor Pawlenty stood up and he said, this is not right. This is not what the business community wants. And then the head of the Minnesota Business Partnership, Charlie Weaver, stood up, said the same thing. And I'll never forget Marilyn Carlson Nelson, who runs the Carlson companies, the Radisson, everything. One of the few women in the room sort of leaned in and said, Governor, they got it exactly right. And this is what we propose to do. And from that point on, the governor sat down and didn't say much else. Charlie Weaver left the room. And we ended up putting together task forces, working groups around the 4 priorities: transportation, childhood, health disparities. And there's actually a patent transfer issue because people felt that we needed to work much more closely between the university system and the private sector. It was very practical. And each of these committees was headed by 2 of the CEOs. And so Jim McNerney, some of you may know, now runs Boeing, was at that point the head of 3M. Dick Schultz, the head of Best Buy, headed one. I mean, these were very high-powered folks. But what happened was a couple of things. One is that they were staffed by McKinsey, essentially. That McKinsey donated its time to sort of prepare materials so that these guys who are used to the highest quality board materials and preparatory materials for their meetings saw those when they walked into the room. And then the really sort of subversive thing is that the actual substantive staffing of transportation, of childhood, of healthcare was done by the nonprofit community. And at first, the corporate liaisons, the heads of community affairs, just went berserk. They said, this is just an elaborate attempt by the McKnight Foundation and the nonprofit sector to preempt the business agenda. But what ended up happening, of course, is over time, the private sector realized that the nonprofit sector had an enormous amount of expertise in transportation, in healthcare, in early childhood development, intellectual property development. And we developed these extraordinary working groups. I go to all of that length to suggest a couple of things I think that come directly out of Paul's opening remarks. Is one, there was this remarkable resistance in a very enlightened place to have these sectors sit at the same table. And 12 years later, the Itasca Project is still meeting every quarter. And they are scrolling through issues one by one by one, and have had success on almost every one. I'm going to tell you just one quick example in a moment. And so the breakdown of the sort of the preconceptions about what different sectors had to offer, how they could work together, was just remarkable. Second, it became a remarkable learning tool for the public sector. The public sector that really thought it had figured out community priorities realized that it had a lot to learn from the business community, from the nonprofit community, from the philanthropic community, and from the university community. And it began, I think, a period of much more intensive joint policy development that sort of got over the usual sort of ideological rigidity that can so often characterize our policy work. And let me just give you an example, and then I'll move on. The very first topic the Itasca Project chose to take on was regional transportation. Twin Cities had never had a regional transportation system. It just, it's a car culture, and end of story. And the Itasca Project organized a couple of inner-city visits. We went to Denver, we went to Seattle, and we realized that communities actually can design from the ground up transportation systems. You don't have to be the New York City subway system or the Boston system. You can actually very carefully use all of the processes of civic planning to put together a system that serves your entire region. But we had probably 10, 15, 20 plans over 10 or 20 years in Minneapolis to try to figure out how to do transit. None of them went anywhere. So I finally asked the head of what we call the Metropolitan Council, which is a regional governance body in Minneapolis and St. Paul. I said, just go lock your door, take a month, take all of those plans, take the best elements of every one of them, and just come and present to the Itasca Project. And so he did. And despite its complexity and despite its potential price tag, the Itasca leadership basically said, we've got to do this. I mean, the head of Best Buy said, I can't get goods across the region effectively. And people like Jim McNerney at 3M said, I hear all the time that our folks are stuck in traffic and they can't get their kids dropped off at daycare and get into work in a timely way. We've just got to break this cycle. So slowly, the sort of consensus built in Itasca for a very significant transportation bill and reform. We used this broad framework to develop a suite of legislative packages, and then something really interesting happened. The CEOs, and again, there were about 40 of them, began having dinners with the legislators. And when you get a call from the head of 3M, or you get a call from the head of General Mills or Medtronic, you come. And so these legislators started coming to these dinners, and they were very small dinners, and they were in the homes of the CEOs. And it was very personalized and very interesting. And one by one, they hit every single legislator. It was almost not playing fair. They hit every single legislator in a Republican-controlled legislature where this was perceived to be sort of a Democratic issue. And so that was impressive. And when the framework was then introduced into legislation, it actually passed the House and the Senate. And Governor Pawlenty, who was still probably smarting from that very first meeting of Itasca, vetoed the bill. And we thought, well, that's that. You've got Republican Senate, Republican House, no way they're going to override a Republican governor's veto. They did. They overrode the veto. And it was because of the Itasca project. There is just no two ways about it. There is no way the nonprofit sector could have delivered this. There is no way that the foundation sector could have delivered this. It was a direct result of the Itasca project. And that has been their methodology ever since. They've taken on more complex issues like early childhood development and health disparities, but they have sort of taken the same approach of trying to build this broad consensus, working both the public, private, and nonprofit angles and getting things done. I have no idea what that has to do with West Virginia, but I think